Rumbek, July 2005. We were in Sudan. I had flown to Nairobi, then flown up to Khartoum, courtesy of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, of which I was a member. That story is told in part the day I met Hamza bin Laden. But after making my, almost by split seconds, escape from Khartoum and flying down on a plane chartered by the SPLM, instead of going down to Nairobi, the plane out of town took me to the town of Rumbek, which for a time had been the rebel headquarters of the Sudan People's Liberation Army. And there, the SPLM put us up in a facility called AFEX, which was run by a company that did mostly safaris in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, African expeditions, AFEX. And they had been contracted by the United Nations to provide lodging. And so inside of a probably 10-acre compound that was set aside for the United Nations, it was considered United Nations territory, it was diplomatic territory. For example, the SPLA was not allowed to enter except for their officers, and if their officers entered, they had to enter unarmed. That was a little silly at times. And a lot of interesting things happened. I ingratiated myself to the blue helmets when I pointed out to a Danish blue helmet that he was being photographed, i.e. spied upon, by a North Vietnamese agent who was also resident there in AFEX. I'm not North Vietnamese, North Korean agent. How did I know? He was North Korean because when I heard him speaking to others of his whatever, I can't think it was on the phone. I know language. I don't speak Korean, but I know it when I hear it. I know when it's not Chinese and not Japanese and not Vietnamese. It's Korean. And he looked Korean, although he was listed as something else. Can't remember what he was listed as. He had a false passport. But anyhow, there we were. And it was a tent. It was tents. It was just like the tents you would be in on a safari. And they provided everything. They provided 3 meals a day. It was part of the expense. My expenses were being covered by the SPLM, who had invited me. They had a shower facility, latrine facility, very nice. It was kind of like staying at a YMCA camp or something like that, or a Jewish community center camp in the country, something like that, a Camp Ramah. Very much like that. You ate your meals together in a pavilion that was open on 3 sides, just a roof, concrete floor, tables, chairs, and that comes up in a different story. And it was a buffet, very primitive sort of a buffet. A couple of hot plates, serve yourself. So, and they had tents, like I said, and your linens were provided every day, your sheets for your cot and your new towels, and they took the old towels away and tidied up your tent for you. And the man who came around and tidied up the tent, they called him Boy. He was in charge of the towels, but he had to do it himself. He was short-handed, so he went to every tent and straightened up your stuff for you. And I learned later that he was a high officer in the intelligence unit of the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the rebel army, going into everyone's tent, all the UN administrators, all of the diplomats Because if you were a diplomat, you stayed there. I mean, the only other place to stay in town was Bros. And Bros was rather primitive. I mean, the food was better, but Bros was rather primitive. And, I mean, the food was better if you like African food. It was very, very Sudanese food, South Sudanese food. Which could get, yeah, if you didn't like millet, you might not want to go to Bros. But Bros was a truck drivers and construction workers motel, okay? So the diplomats stayed at AFEX, and the high-ranking officers, the highest-ranking officers of the SPLA either stayed at the SPLA Army compound or they stayed at Bros for the privacy, because the UN was not there. I stayed at Bros on a later visit, a couple of years later. So anyhow, there we were, and there were all kinds of people there. There were newspaper people. We got to be friends with the reporters from the Washington Post and the Atlanta Constitution Journal, whatever it's called. And there were news reporters from all over the world. There were all kinds of UN people. There was the bomb squad. No, it was the Norwegian group that does demining, taking anti-personnel mines up out of roads and gardens and fields. And all kinds of people like this. And a lot of contractors. You had road contractors from the USA that were there trying to get contracts. Because at that time, the CPA, Comprehensive Peace Agreement, had been signed in January. 6 months later, according from the 6 months from the day it was signed, then in Khartoum, John Garang, the head of the SPLM, had been inaugurated as first vice president of Sudan and president of the autonomous region of South Sudan, which eventually became the nation of South Sudan 5 years later, which was all written up in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. But we were in kind of an interim period because they had not, quote, formed a government yet, and that'll be talked about in another video. But they were pulling it all together, organizing the education department, the health department, so roads department, so on, all getting organized there in Rumbek, the provisional capital. And Rumbek is a small cattle market town composed almost entirely of thatched mud huts. The few masonry buildings in town had been bombed to the ground, mostly by the North during the war. So we were staying at AFEX, and one of the people, some of the people that were there were diplomats from the United States and some other interesting people. And there was one that was she was sort of interesting. Her name was Sam. Sometimes it was Sam, and sometimes it was Samantha. And she had, to me, a very unnotable person. I mean, she had hair that was, depending on how the sun fell on it, it was brown, or it was red, or it was blonde. Typical American woman. And she acted like a typical American, thinks she's important woman. Okay? The kind of people that have too much education for their own good. And she was there, you know, and the curious thing was, sometimes when you asked her her job, she would say, "Oh, I work for USAID." Okay. But then she'd get introduced to another group and she'd say, "I'm from the office of Senator Barack Obama." So who do you work for, lady? If you look at a certain biography, you'll see a window of time, July 2005, that is between two jobs, and it's the two jobs I named. But she was there, and I got to know her just a little bit, and I probably ate one or two meals with her. You know, it's just tables laid out in a pavilion, kind of like being at a family reunion, huge family reunion picnic, you know. And I was trying to talk about taking care of the 250,000 street orphans that the war had left. And when she found I didn't have connections, she lost interest in me and wouldn't talk to me much anymore. And I was considered kind of a nobody because I didn't really have any connections. But I was there to be a photographer, and I did a lot of photographing, and had breakfast. I believe it was a Monday morning. Now we've got to realize that we're halfway around the world. So Monday morning in South Sudan is Sunday evening late in Washington, D.C. So we have breakfast, and I walk away from the breakfast table to take my camera with me, go back to the tent, and I don't know what I was going to do. And I don't know what came first. And I noticed that she was in the orange orchard because it's not like they planted an orange orchard to go with aphex. It's just the piece of ground that they claimed to use for aphex included an orange orchard. And I don't know whether I noticed that she'd gone out into the orange orchard to kind of be alone with her satellite phone, or whether I went out there to photograph a bird, but there was a scissor-tailed Whydah. It's got a magnificent tail, long tail like this, you know? And I wanted to get its photograph. I tried for days to get the photograph of a scissor-tailed Whydah, and there was one popping around, and I started trying to take its picture. In the meantime, start taking a picture of the little blue bird that had the azure red-cheeked something. Cute little bird like a sparrow, only it was blue and had red cheeks, or was it the other way around? And then a hoopoe decided to display, and it puts this little thing up on its head and goes, whoop-bo, whoop-bo, and you know, so I'm taking pictures. She's on the phone, and I hear her get started, and that's what the video is about. She's on the phone, and she says, "Good morning, Barry. I know you're not in the office, but I'm going to put this on your machine." Ooh, that sounds interesting. "So I know you'll hear it first thing when you come into the office in the morning." Okay. Now, my mommy taught me not to eavesdrop, which is how I learned how exactly to position my ear up against the keyhole. So, I was photographing the bird, and I managed to always be photographing a bird, and the bird, I always found a bird that was even closer and closer to Sam, and I never stared at Sam. Looked like I was listening on a phone call. I was photographing a bird, and that bird was always closer and closer to Sam, and I'm listening. And you can judge that however you want. And she starts describing a program that she has put together, that's almost complete. You see, South Sudan was moving in one jump, in one decade. South Sudan, at the end of the war, 2005, which this was right at the beginning of, we were only 6 months into this, and in one decade they were moving from, depending on the tribe, either Stone Age, Bronze Age, or in a few cases early Iron Age, into the 21st century. I mean, we're going from Stone Age to cell phones in one jump. There's not a whole lot of people who knew how to use a computer. Not even a whole lot of people who knew how to use a typewriter. And they needed to form a modern government. So she had this program that she was describing to Barry on the phone, that she had volunteers from America that somebody was paying the travel and salary of. Never found out who. Because it didn't quite seem like it was a full-fledged USAID program, although it was billed, she said it was described as a volunteer program under the USAID. And it was secretaries, executive secretaries, the kind of women, and I guess in some cases men, who know how to use an IBM PC very well, how to use it for spreadsheets, and so on, how to get online and book tickets with the airlines, how to use Microsoft Word extremely well so that they could take dictation, write down, put it all up in a Microsoft Word form, do the spreadsheets, do the accounting, and so on. And she had placed these people in every office with Microsoft Windows-based PCs that their program supplied. And as she put it up, she said she's got the network connections done, connected, and there was a network satellite dish connected through a United Nations station there. And we were getting the satellite, the connections hooked up, and it will be mirrored in DC. Everything that is done inside the government, the sovereign government of South Sudan, will be mirrored in Barack Obama's office in Washington, D.C. He was senator then. Okay. That does not sound copacetic to me. Now, I'm in another country, and I'm subject to the laws of that country. And I mean, we expect immigrants, if they come here, or even tourists, if they come here, if they see a crime being committed, that they would dial 911 and say, hey, there's a girl getting raped behind a bush over here. I mean, don't we expect that of our tourists and immigrants? The only people that we don't expect that of is diplomats, and I was not there on a diplomatic passport. I was not exempt from their laws. And I'm sitting there going, what she's talking about is against the law. That ain't right. That ain't right. Huh. So she says we've got it was one department she named, they didn't have them in there. But she had them in, and especially she had them in the travel, she was just getting them into the travel department, the little department that would handle travel for all of the cabinet and any sub-cabinet members of the government. So that anybody who went anywhere, if the assistant foreign minister, the under-assistant foreign minister, got on a plane and took a trip to Nepal for a diplomatic mission, it would be known in Washington, even if it was a secret mission. That's not right. That's not right. Well, she went on for 20 minutes like that, and I snapped a lot of pictures of birds. And she got off the phone, off her satellite phone, and I went to my tent, put down the camera for a minute, made like that's where I was headed, went back up to Aphex. And what would happen after breakfast every morning is that all of the lower cabinet members in the South Sudan cabinet would have their second breakfast in a circle of chairs out in the open. They would have kingfisher. If you've been to Africa, you know what kingfisher is. If you haven't, you don't. Okay. So they're up there and they offer me a kingfisher, and I accept a bottle of Fanta or Knee-High, whichever it was. And I tell them all about it. They were very interested. Around noon, the noon flight from that little dirt strip called Rumbek Airport took off, went to Nairobi via Lokochokio. Might have gone direct. But on it was a minor official of South Sudanese new government. He went down to Kenya and started putting advertisements in the Nairobi newspaper for secretaries to come up to Rumbek and Juba and serve the new government, because they didn't have anybody trained in South Sudan. He started hiring, and you can always hire people off the street in Nairobi. They've got something like an 80% unemployment rate. 80%. So they started hiring Kenyans. And all of those people that were volunteers from America were told by about 1 o'clock that afternoon, it's okay, we appreciate your offer, but you can go home now. And they replaced all the computers, or scrubbed them, to get that malware out of them. And I bet Sam and Barry, to this day, don't know how that happened.